How's everyone's night going, panelists? Alrighty, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining tonight. Today we have a great topic that we'd love to answer all of your questions about. Today we'll be talking about med school applications, the heart of the application, and just all, and we're here to answer all questions you have about it. So first we'll just start out by introducing all of ourselves as panelists. And we can kind of go around. I guess I will start. So my name is Nicole. I'm an MS3 at DGSOM. I'm originally from Alabama. So I applied, I guess, out of state. If you have more questions about that. And then I took 2 gap years. So yeah. And then maybe if Kristen, you want to go next.
Sure. So, hi, everybody. I'm Kristen. I'm also an MS3 here at UCLA. I grew up in Maine and went to college in Philly and took 2 gap years living in Boston before applying to med school.
Awesome. Christine, if you want to go.
Hi everyone, my name is Christine. I am an MS1 here at DGSOM. Prior to matriculating into medical school, I actually went to UCLA and completed my undergrad degree. I'm originally from Pasadena, and then I ended up staying after I finished my undergrad degree and I got my master's at UCLA as well. And then I worked for 2 years at UCLA. So I never really left. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask away.
Amazing. Serenay, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone. My name is Serenay. I'm an MS3. I am originally from Orange County, California, so not too far away from here. I went to UC Irvine actually for my undergrad degree. Took a gap year, served in AmeriCorps during that year, and then matriculated to DGSOM. Happy to be here.
Yes, thank you for being here. And then maybe Arthur, if you want to go next.
Hi everyone, my name is Arthur. I'm an MS1 here. I also went to UCLA for undergrad, similar to Christine. I kind of never left after undergrad. I did 2 gap years and I did research here at UCLA and then matriculated to medical school. So yeah, pretty much have been here since high school.
Amazing. And then lastly, but not least, Imani. Oh, can you guys hear her by chance? Okay, I don't think we can hear you for some reason.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. My name is Imani Evans. I work in the Office of Outreach and Pathway Programs at DGSOM. So I'm not a medical student, but I do work closely with the admissions team. Our office offers pathway programs for undergraduate students from community college to recent college graduates getting ready to apply to medical school, as well as reapplicants who are looking to, help boost their application for that second time around, as well as a pre-health guidance center. So I'd be happy to share any links and resources that our office can offer you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining. That is definitely a great person to have on our team tonight. Alrighty, so the first topic we will talk about is how to make your application stand out. So I'll go around and ask the panelists a couple of questions, but also attendees, feel free to put any questions in the chat at any point. You can also raise your hand or unmute yourself at any point if you want to ask a question. Okay, so the first question for the panelist is about writing your personal statement. So what was the process of writing your personal statement? How did you come up with the topic? Who did you reach out to when you were trying to edit your personal statement? Really just any tips on that. Maybe Kristen, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So, I think for me, the hardest part of the personal statement was just preparing to write it. Um, I think it takes a lot of reflection to figure out what you want to say and be able to articulate why you actually want to go to medical school and become a physician. And so I think the biggest thing to do at this point in getting ready is just take some time and really sit with what your experiences have been. What have you done in your life that's actually pushed you onto this career path? Because I think a lot of people have a really difficult time articulating that in their personal statements, and that's where they can kind of fall flat at times. So I think that was the hardest part for me. Otherwise, the personal statement really is just telling your story. So I picked out a couple of moments that were particularly poignant from my personal experience and what drove me towards medicine. I don't think you necessarily need to have like an overarching theme or some sort of motif. It's not like a creative writing project. It really is just telling your story and what led you to this point in time. I made everybody I could read my essay. I don't feel like I'm a super strong writer, so I leaned on a lot of like friends, advisors, parents, loved ones, anybody who was willing to read my personal statement. I sent it to them and got their feedback. So I think it was just helpful to have a lot of sets of eyes on it because it was an important part of the application.
Amazing. Thank you for that. And then Serenay, if you want to go next.
Mhm. Yeah, so I totally agree with everything Kristen had mentioned, like 100%. I would say that in terms of getting feedback, like similar to Kristen, like I asked a ton of people for feedback. In particular, I wanted like medical students, like current med students, to take a look at my essay because, faculty members will have different advice than your parents and your siblings. So I think that was pretty useful. And so I would highly suggest, like, if you know a med student, like just have them take a look at your essay. But in regard to like accepting feedback, like don't feel pressured to accept like everyone's, you know, edits and like take everything like to heart, because you will get a lot of different perspectives about how you can write things a bit better or make things like sound different than how you wanted it to sound in your statement. So I would just, take everyone's like edits kind of with a grain of salt and see if that would make your statement better ultimately. But in regards to like grammatical errors or edits, like I lean towards like Grammarly. Like I paid for their premium subscription to have just like better grammatical like edits to my statement because like Kristen, I'm not like a wonderful writer. So I think that was also useful to catch like tiny mistakes.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to echo the Grammarly. I did the same thing because I also just feel like I'm not a great writer, so I just needed that backup personally. And I also want to just agree with your point about, having not taking everyone's feedback to heart per se. Like you can really pick and choose what feedback you want to respond to. You don't have to, make every single change that everyone suggests. I will say at one point for me, there were too many cooks in the kitchen, too many people telling me to do different things. So I just kind of had to kind of pick and choose which direction I wanted my personal statement to go in. Christine, if you want to go next.
Sure. I mean, what all the panelists brought up are things that I experience as well. I think one thing that I personally struggled with was that I wanted to get it right on the first go. And what you'll come to realize is that writing the personal statement is kind of like it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You're not going to finish it in one sitting. And you need to sometimes allow yourself to like write a little bit and then walk away from it and come back to it with fresh eyes and look at it. I think it took me like what, between 10 to 16 drafts. I can't remember, somewhere in that range before I finally finished my personal statement and was really happy with it. The reality of it is that each time you write, you're going to find something that you're going to nitpick on, and that's okay. But at some point, I think you also have to like allow yourself and to just accept the fact that it's never going to be 100%, but it's the best that you can do in that period of time. So I think giving yourself that grace as you're going through the writing process to understand that it's going to take time. You're not going to be able to necessarily crank it out in one sitting. I think in terms of who I asked to read my personal statement, I actually took a bit of a different approach. I didn't ask everybody. I asked maximum of 4 to 5 people who I absolutely trusted in terms of giving me honest feedback. And I refrained from giving my personal statement to any of my family members because I thought that that would bias them into telling me that it was a good statement. And obviously, as you can see, like everyone takes a different approach. But for me, I handed it to friends that were currently in medical school who could kind of give me a little bit more of an objective eye as to how my personal statement sounded. And that kind of worked well for me because, as was mentioned, you don't want to have too many cooks in the kitchen because then that could uh, take away from your voice as you're writing your personal statement.
Thank you. And then Arthur, if you have any tips.
Yeah, I think everything that was said was really great. A couple points that um, I want to add. First and foremost, I don't think that your goal should be to stand out through your personal statement. I think your goal should be to write a personal statement that's authentic and that matches with the journey you've had throughout your life to this point in time applying to medical school. Fundamentally, after someone reads your personal statement, the number one question that you want to have answered for that person is, why does this person want to go to medical school to become a doctor? If you can really answer that and it makes a lot of sense, you've succeeded on this aspect of your application. I think that's really, really the goal. To stand out is really kind of like going against the entire purpose, in my personal opinion. You know, people can disagree. It's kind of like a subjective art form, essay writing, but I really think it just comes down to, can you articulate in a in a concise and convincing and logical manner through your experiences, why do you want to be a doctor? And to kind of follow up on that, it really should be about you. It has to be about you. It has to be about what have you done to convince yourself that this is the path you want to dedicate the rest of your life to. You know, I've read personal statements from other students who've asked me for, you know, my input, and it kind of would talk about, you know, I saw this doctor during a shadowing experience, and he or she did really great with this or that, and that really inspired me. Okay, that's fine, but that's a very passive experience. What have you kind of done to also show admissions committees that you really explored this actively yourself? It's not just some idea. I mean, granted, no one's practiced medicine yet, but you really want to show that you care so much and you're so dedicated that you're putting your actions where your words are, not just words, if that makes sense. And on a similar note, you know, I took a little bit of a different approach. I didn't really ask anyone to read my essay except for my fiance, because I just showed her my essay and I asked her, does this sound like me? Is this me? Is this why I want to go to medicine? You know, however much you know me, does this resonate with what you know about why I want to go to medicine? And after I got a yes, then I knew that that was authentic and that's what I wanted to send to admissions committees. So those are my little pieces of advice.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. I thought those were really good tips as well. And then, Amani, if you have any tips from the admissions office perspective, I'm sure they would appreciate that too.
Yeah, from kind of a reviewing standpoint, we do review personal statements for two of our pathway programs, our SHP and PrEP. And that's kind of like an intro really for students to get ready and kind of get into the habit of telling their story. Similar to what Kristen Arthur were saying, is you have to do kind of sit with and evaluate why you want to go into medicine. And that is a very personal reason. We do exercises with our prep students and our RAP students, which kind of helps them reflect on their journey to medicine. So if you're thinking about it in a very literal, like map kind of way, what are the stops on there that helps you kind of those moments where you're like, oh yeah, this brings me back to medicine, or this is why I want to do it. But kind of echoing what Arthur was saying, it has to be centered to you. A lot of students tend to be, there's this one experience that inspired me, and then they kind of focus on that, but then they don't fit into the extra where, and then that encouraged me to, you know, start an organization or get involved with them or volunteer, get clinical experience in this area. So making sure that you're essential to it is kind of key because like what Arthur was saying, it is about you. Um, yeah, I would say those are the main focuses.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you all for your advice on that part of the application. Okay, the next part of the application we're going to talk about is how to choose which experiences to highlight on your activities section. And more specifically, how do you decide on what is going to be your most meaningful experiences? I'll give you a second to ponder. And then Sarah will have you start with this one.
Okay. Let's see. So I guess the activity section was pretty difficult for me because I had too many activities. But fortunately, I think that I spent enough time in like certain activities like throughout my undergrad career or during my gap year to allow me to see that it had the most meaning in my journey towards medical school. So for instance, like there was one club I was in for 4 years while I was at UC Irvine. And I think it was most meaningful because I was able to work from, let's say, like a camper. And then each year I got into a higher position and ultimately became one of the co-directors of the organization. And I felt like I was able to make such a big impact throughout those 4 years. So I think that's kind of what helped me establish what was most meaningful to me because of um, the extent of time and the time and energy that I had spent into a particular organization. Um, and as well as like any gap year activities that you think is most meaningful, like I think that is worth putting. Like I had mentioned, I had served in AmeriCorps during my gap year, and I felt like it was the most meaningful, one of the most meaningful experiences because I was able to do so much through this program, and especially during the pandemic. And so I felt like it was something that I needed, like more, what is it called, characters or words to like write about my like experience and how it had partly like changed my life and made me really decide like I want to include this in my application to show whoever's reading it that I'm very committed to medicine. And this is one of the experiences that kind of opened my eyes to, you know, what I could do as a future physician because of this experience. So ultimately, I think I'm rambling a bit, but I think it's just you have to have like some sort of a gut feeling of, the activities that you're involved with and ultimately narrow down like what activities you spent the most time in and your growth throughout those activities.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was a great answer. Um, After pondering, I'd like to add my little tips as well. So in terms of the activities section, I think it's helpful to think about if you're still early on in your college career, and you're seriously considering medicine, like what kind of story do you want to tell about yourself on the application? Are you really passionate about mentorship? If so, maybe you want to get involved in a couple different mentorship clubs. Are you really passionate about outreach in communities? If so, maybe you want to do a lot of volunteering or, work with a nonprofit, things like that. So just really figure out what you're passionate about, and what you want to come through on your application and dedicate yourself to those activities. All right. And then maybe Christine, if you want to go next.
Sure. I'll just add on a few points to what you just mentioned, Nicole. I think one thing that a lot of students miss the mark on when it comes to applying to medical school and working on this application is that they think that if I list more activities, that's going to grab the admissions committee's attention and that's going to be a good thing. And I want to caution you on that because whenever you're writing about these experiences, anything you put on your application is fair game to ask about during your interviews, right? So if you've done something, but you haven't been so involved in it, maybe take a step back and think about, well, is it worth me putting this on my application just to say that I've done it, just to check off a box, right? So I think just like your personal statement, where you kind of have to take a second and really reflect on why you want to go into medicine, I think the same thing goes for your activities. You need to take a step back and think about, okay, why did I get involved in this activity in the first place? Like, what is it about this activity that excites me? And what do I hope to take away from this and bring into my future career as a physician? Personally, for me, that was research, teaching, and like a lot of global health work. And so those were my three meaningful pearls that I spent a lot of time talking about in my application. And those were things that I had spent considerable amount of time into starting from the time that I was an undergrad. And so that's why it made the most sense to me to talk about those things. So I really encourage all of you as you're kind of getting ready to embark on this application cycle, whenever that may be, of course, to really take a second to really think about why you're getting involved in a certain club or why you're doing a certain activity. Because if it's just to put it on your application, um, you're not going to be able to fully authentically talk about it in such a way that's going to grab the reader's attention. You really want to take the time to really invest yourself in whatever activity that it is you're pursuing so that you have something to talk about on your app.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with all of that. And then Arthur, if you want to go next.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I couldn't agree more with what Christine just said. You have to be very deliberate with what you include in your application. So that's a really important point. Just about the logistics a little bit, you have three most meaningfuls that you can designate on your application. Logically, they should be something that you spent a considerable amount of time on, right? Just because people don't think that it can be that meaningful if you've only spent, some Saturday, 3 years ago on. That's not what admissions committees are looking for. So definitely time involvement should be a consideration, but most importantly, how has that experience impacted you? And one step further, how have you impacted that organization or that experience or that patient population or that population? It might be that you worked at a YMCA or you worked at uh, a food bank. How have you made an impact there? I think that's really important. And what's also important is that extra character space you get on the application is not really to expand on, what the organization or the activity is about. There's a specific question there. It's why is this most meaningful? And I think you should really take that space to answer that question because, I mean, firstly, that's what the prompt is, right? So that's what they're looking for. And also, that's where you show the kind of person you are because it's not necessarily the experience that matters to admissions committees. It's what has this experience turned you into? Like, what kind of person has this experience made you? Right? Because you're most likely not going to be continuing that experience, but those lessons that you've gained and those impacts that you've had on those people, that's what admissions committees want to see because that gives them a glimpse into the kind of person, the kind of medical student, the kind of doctor you're going to be. I think that's really important. And just one more point. Ideally, this is just my opinion. I think it's stronger if your most meaningful experiences can be you can have a letter of recommendation for those most meaningful experiences because it's an extra voice validating what you're saying. It's very easy for someone to say, I did this, that. But if someone else can vouch for you and say, this person was really great at this person was really great at that, and they've left a considerable impact on so many people's lives, that goes way, way further than you saying you did that. Just because we're all biased to say great things about our own selves. So someone else saying that is huge. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks. And then Kristen, if you want to go next.
Yeah, so I think I would echo what Arthur said, and what's been said before is like the med school application is very literal. When they ask you, why do you want to be a doctor? Write an essay that answers that question. When they ask you, what are your most meaningful experiences? Pick the three experiences that were the most meaningful to you and write about them. It's not a trick question. They actually want to know that information and what was most meaningful to you. So whether that is, years and years of research and a bunch of publications, or whether that is being the captain of your dance team, it doesn't matter what was the most impactful to what made you who you are. I think maybe the one time I would really push that you should have something dedicated on there is if you're taking a gap year or gap years, you probably want to have whatever you're doing in your gap years as one of your most meaningful because that's going to take up a ton of time and feels a little silly to me that you'd be taking years off in between med school and undergrad and not really having a good rationale as to why if that's not a meaningful experience for you. So yeah, that would be my one plug. And then filling the rest of the things out. I think I don't have much to add as what the other panelists have already said. Just be deliberate and choose what experiences were impactful to you. I think you have maybe if you have a huge long resume and too many things to fill up the spaces, you can then start to cherry pick the things that either you feel most passionate about or that kind of show your well-roundedness as an applicant. So you don't necessarily want to have only research stuff dumped on there, but if you have a couple of other things that you can sprinkle in, I think that's helpful as well. But just being kind of deliberate in your choices of what you're showing them, and making sure that's showing kind of authentically who you are.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to just agree with what Kristen said about the gap years. If you do end up taking a gap year or years plural, that should definitely be one of your most meaningful experiences. And you should really be able to talk about, what you did during your gap years and how that has influenced your opinion on going to medical school. One other thing that I wanted to just throw in there was like formatting for this section. You can do it in a couple ways. You can either write a whole like long paragraph within the character count, or you can do bullet points. I kind of did a mix of both where I wrote like a little blurb about, how I participated in that activity. And then I did bullet points maybe for like things I accomplished or different things like that. So just something to think about. And then, Amani, if you have any tips for this section.
Yeah, really just echoing everything everyone said. And then kind of going back to how you think about your journey to medicine overall. If this is one of those things that stands out amongst all of that, then it's something that you get excited and that you can talk about for a while, or you can provide additional context that won't be provided on your application. It's those things that, kind of spark joy where you're just kind of your eyes excited and you're like, you want to continue talking about it. And this would also be a good section to if it's not something that you do during your gap year, you also have other opportunities throughout your application, your personal statement, as secondaries, if you do get to that point, to provide additional context in case one of your most meaningful experiences was in your undergrad or was doesn't necessarily fit into that gap.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And then for the next part of the application process, I wanted to ask the applicants if there's anything you wish you had known before the application process started, and specifically, when do you think is a good date to start working on your application? Um, so I'll go ahead and answer the first part of that, which is what I think would have been good to know about before the application process started. I think it would have been helpful to know that a lot of the prompts that schools use for their secondaries that they send out, which is basically school-specific questions that they send out to you after you've already submitted your primary application to all schools. Um, Basically, those prompts are often reused from year to year, and you can find a lot of those prompts online. So you can already start to like think about what your answer would be for some of these prompts and try to like write up some answers. That would have been very helpful before the application process started, because once you submit your primary app and the secondaries start rolling in, it's like you got to try to turn those around as quickly as possible. So I think that would have been really helpful. And then let's see, maybe Arthur, if you want to start this one.
Yeah, with regards to when to start really preparing your application, I would start, if you're applying for this upcoming cycle, I would start now. It doesn't really hurt to get drafts of your activity mini essays and your personal statement, asking letter writers if you've already asked, following up with letter writers, because your application is not going to be considered complete until your letters actually arrive. I would start now. I think January is a good time to start, and we just finished January, so it's only going to help you. You'll get more drafts of your personal statement. The more drafts, the better, just because you'll polish the writing a little bit naturally. That just happens with time. Same thing with the other mini extracurricular essays. And yeah, to echo what was already said about something I wish I knew before. I mean, I kind of did know this, but it became more evident as secondaries came in that those prompts are pretty consistent year to year. So same advice here. I mean, if you're obviously prioritize the primary application first, just because of the timeline. But once you're comfortable with that, get started on the secondaries, because the secondary workload is tremendous. I cannot I can't overstate that. It is a lot of writing. So the sooner you get started, the faster your turnaround time is going to be for rolling admission schools. That's a huge bonus.
Great, thank you. And then maybe Serenay.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that was said um, already, but I think I had, I wish I had known about a resource or a place where you can upload letters of rec. I think that is called Interfolio and it's still used for admissions. And I think it's pretty useful because you can ask your letter writers to upload their letters into Interfolio ahead of time because I believe you're not able to have letter writers upload their letters until the AMCAS or AACOMA's application opens early May. And so if you want to just help them out and to get your letters in earlier rather than later, I think that would be a good resource to use. And I think it was just a small fee to have your letters transferred into your main application. So definitely take a look at that when you're thinking about letters and um, resources to help out your letter writers.
That's awesome. I had never heard of that before, but that sounds fantastic. Kristen, if you have any tips.
Yeah, I would say similar to what you guys said, the secondaries were a real doozy, and especially like I was on gap year, that was working a demanding job full time. That was a very intense couple of weeks over the summer. So, as much as you can be proactive about the cycle, it's really a little bit of like sometimes you just got to put your head down and write a bunch of essays, and it's tough. And once you get to the interview portion of the application cycle, it's much more fun and relaxed and casual than feeling like you have to just turn in a bunch of term papers all at once that could decide the fate of your future. So it is really stressful. And I would say, as much as you can, like work ahead on both your primary application by starting that now. And if you're able to get your drafts of everything in a place that you feel confident in, then you can start working on your secondaries even earlier, especially for the schools that you are really excited about. And that I think can really help you in the long.
Yeah, thank you. And then Christine, have you had a chance to answer this one yet? I don't think so,
I
right?
am not, but I will echo what everyone has said because it's so valid and it's so true. Um, I think in terms of your letters of recommendation, I 10 out of 10 recommend getting those way ahead of time. I think I got mine September before the upcoming application cycle. I started asking then, and then I followed up for people who didn't get it back to me. And I had a deadline in my head of like when I wanted to have all the letters in my interfolio ready to go. And I think that saved me a lot of time when it actually came time to submitting my primary application because I wasn't concerned about my letters. I was just more focused on my application. I'd also say January is probably a really good time to start working on your primary application. Start writing a little bit of your personal statement, getting some ideas flowing. Because, as Arthur mentioned, the more drafts you do, the better, the more polished it can become with time. Um, I think, I wouldn't say this is something I wish I knew because I think I kind of knew this going into the cycle, but I would have to agree that your secondaries do take a lot out of you. So really pace yourself. I think that's one piece of advice I can give is that you're gonna get a bunch of secondaries coming in all at once, and you're gonna feel so overwhelmed that you're gonna question like, is the process all worth it? And I'll tell you, it is completely worth it. But you have to remind yourself, like, just to take it a few prompts at a time. And this is where pre-writing really helps. Obviously, you're not going to have an essay for every single prompt ready to go. But if you have a skeleton of the major topics you want to talk about, if you like browse online and find like what the general essay prompts are, you could kind of create a skeleton for the major themes and then have a draft and then modify it for each school as you go. And what you'll find is that as you go through the secondaries, it becomes easier and easier because now you could reuse some of those essays and just tweak a couple of things here and there to better fit the prompts that you are expected to answer for that particular school. But definitely recommend starting early.
Yes, I definitely agree with all of that as well. And then Amani, if you have any tips for this part of the application.
Yeah, I mean, to pick up where Christine left off about starting early, some of the main questions we get in our pre-health guidance center is what can I do as an undergrad to get ready to apply to medical school? And I think the earlier you get involved, the earlier you start gaining experiences, the better. I think someone had mentioned it earlier, where longevity of experiences is definitely helpful. It's not going to hurt you if you do something for a month or 2 months, but the longer you are with the organization in this specific experience, the more you're able to learn from and give back to. So that's something that you can add on your application for sure. Um, I would recommend looking into academic enrichment programs, things you can do over the summer, just so that you can find different ways to engage with, the medical profession, healthcare professions in general, whether that be in a clinical experience, whether that be a post-bac program if you do take a gap year, or something, a lot, shameless plug for our office, but, other ways that you can spend your summer in academic enrichment. Just like I mentioned, other ways to, other different type of experiences. You learn different things from similar experiences. I would also recommend if you're still an undergrad to take as much advantage of the institution as an undergrad. You can find research opportunities, community service opportunities. There is a lot of infrastructure available as an undergraduate student that you use as soon as you graduate, or it becomes different as an alumni. So I would definitely reach out to pre-health advisors if you have them, pre-med advisors, career advisors. If you want to prep for interviews, they sometimes have interview prep at career centers. Um, all of that stuff. So definitely, take advantage of what's available to you now. And then to continue the theme of secondaries, I know our RAP students were part of our reapplication program, they were definitely inundated, and that was something that really impacted them. So as much as you can prepare for them, and then for those that mention or don't mention a due date, if you consider 2 weeks, just so that you can start to prioritize them. So nothing falls through the cracks, that might be a good thing to keep in mind as well.
Thank you. So many good tips tonight. Alrighty, so we're going to move on to the next section, which is talking about interviews. So this is kind of a loaded question, but I wanted to get the panelists' perspective on different questions that were asked during traditional interviews and how to prepare for traditional interviews, and also different questions that were asked during MMI interviews and how to prepare for that. And whether or not your interviews were in person or virtual. So I guess I can start with just talking about what these different interviews are and the composition of them. So the traditional interview, which I had totally virtually during COVID, is basically just, when a doctor or whoever your interviewer is, possibly med student, is asking you a bunch of questions. They really just want to get to know you. They have seen your application. They think you're a strong enough applicant for this school already, if you've already gotten an interview, which is great news. And you really just kind of have to show them who you are, and speak to the things on your application. So one question that I was always asked during traditional interviews is, why do you want to go to medical school? Why do you want to be a doctor? So definitely have an answer prepared for that. And then a couple other questions that I was always asked about were related to my most meaningful experiences. So one of my most meaningful experiences was research. So they just asked me a few questions about that. And then another one of my most meaningful experiences was like working with a nonprofit. So I talked about a lot about that as well. And then with the MMI interviews, that's short for multiple mini interviews. But basically, how that works is it's a series of questions that you have a specific amount of time to answer. So, for instance, in a lot of my interviews, I would have about, I think it was like 5 minutes, maybe 3 minutes to answer a specific question. Sometimes you have an interviewer on the other side that is physically asking you the question, and sometimes the question will just appear on the screen. And then when you're ready, after I think they give you like 2 minutes to ponder on your answer, then you can answer the question that was presented to you. Often these are more like ethical questions. What would you do in this scenario, for instance? And there's a lot of resources online to help you prepare for these as well. Okay, so that was a little overview. Now I'm gonna hand it off to Christine if you want to start.
Sure. I think Nicole, you covered it perfectly, but I think for me, so I participated in both a few traditional interviews as well as MMIs. And actually, one of the schools that I interviewed at also had like a group interview with a current medical student. And so that was also a very interesting scenario. Basically, the student was kind of asking all of us the same question, and then we would go around and answer it. And it could be anything about like our hobbies all the way to like why we want to pursue medicine. So that was definitely one of the more unique type of interviews that aren't outside of the scope of like traditional and MMI. I think for me, I got the same exact questions for the traditional interviews. It was a lot of why do you want to be a doctor? Why medicine? Tell me about your research. And, you know, tell me about your most meaningful volunteer experience or your most meaningful leadership experience. So it was a lot of the questions were just directly off of my application and having them ask me to articulate that verbally to them in a concise, coherent, logical manner. And then for my MMIs, similar to Nicole, it was you would get placed in breakout rooms because I all my interviews were online, and I'd have like 2 minutes to read the prompt, and then I think about 7 to 8 minutes, wherein I would answer the question, and then the person interviewing me would follow up with subsequent questions, and we would just have a dialogue until the time ran out, and then I would move on to the next room. I'd say that in terms of like preparation, you should know your application inside and out because you wrote it. And so definitely as you go into interviews, it's always a good idea to kind of read up on your personal statement, read on your activities, as well as your secondaries to just remind yourself like what is the message that I want to convey during my interview because inevitably that will come out as you're talking to the adcoms. And then in terms of the MMIs, there are a lot of resources online with sample MMI questions. And so I had a few friends that were applying during the same cycle. So what we would do is every 2 weeks or every so often, we would meet up on Zoom and we would do mock MMIs with one another and give each other feedback. I think one key like note that I want to put here for online interviews is that you always have to stare at that green dot in order to make eye contact because sometimes it's easy to just look down and look at the faces that you see on Zoom, but what you don't realize is that eye contact is something that's a little bit hard to get virtually. So you have to train yourself to look at that green dot no matter how hard it is. And so that's where like having those mock MMI sessions, those mock online interviews helped tremendously. But again, as with anything, you need to take time to prepare for these things. Don't wait until the last minute, the night before your interview to start preparing. So
Yeah, great tips. Arthur, if you want to go next.
Yeah, so for MMIs, one really quick tip I have that I thought was really helpful. Typically, MMIs tend to be kind of ethical type questions. Um, there's this resource, University of Washington Medical School, University of Washington Medical Center's website that really kind of goes over so many bioethics topics that's super, super helpful to kind of brush up on before your first set of MMIs or just interviews in general, kind of getting a deeper idea of what are a lot of the important, medical debates or medical, ethical problems of the modern day. Having being able to talk about it and to rationalize your way through a question like that shows a lot about your preparation, number one, and also, kind of your intellectual and emotional maturity. With regards to traditional interviews, I mean, I don't really have too much to add other than what was already said. You definitely have to know why you want to be a doctor. It shouldn't be exactly like what your personal statement is, right? You don't want this to be a 7 minute answer. Your interview is probably 30 minutes. So you want it to be the interview should be a conversation. It should be a dialogue, not just, you providing a speech the entire time. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And fundamentally, they're looking for, does the person we read on paper match up with the person I'm seeing through, these days, the computer screen. But that's what they're trying to assess. Are you mature? Are you professional? Are you responsible? Are you respectful? All of these things. Can you articulate well? Can you speak well? Do I trust what you're saying? And at the end of it, you want to leave your interviewer with the impression that, 20, 30 years down the line, when you're a doctor, obviously you'll be a doctor, hopefully sooner than that. But the point is, would I trust this person after all their training to take care of my grandmother? Right? Like that's one question an interviewer might be asking. If you can answer that, you got an A+ interview right there.
Yeah, those are some great tips. Kristen, if you want to go next.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing for interviews is just preparing well. You cannot be over prepared for an interview. Whether it's in general, I would say 99% of the time avoid medical/pre-med Reddit at all costs, but they do have a lot of great resources and examples of interview questions that get asked frequently. So maybe just use some searches and find those there. I know I did it and found that really helpful. I made a very long Google Doc where I wrote common interview questions and I ahead of time typed out answers so that I knew what I wanted to say and what my like bullet points were, so that when somebody asked, why do you want to go to medicine? I had a 2-minute response to that I could very eloquently articulate what I wanted to say. Or when somebody asked about strengths or weaknesses or whatever other common interview questions, I had some poignant examples that I had thought about recently. I could read over my Google Doc the couple of days prior to the interview and reference back to that and say, okay, I have a couple of examples of things that are top of mind that I can then use to talk about whatever they ask me about in these interviews. And same thing goes for the MMIs. Like just practicing that weird format of an MMI is going to be really important for you to be able to articulate yourself and sound confident and smart in those couple of minutes that you have. So I think keys for that is start by repeating back the question. Say, whatever they're asking you, clarify, make sure you understand and you're answering the correct question. Usually these MMI questions have some sort of debate where there's both pros and cons to either side. So show that you're able to understand the benefits of what choice you make and the cons of that. And then you also have to make a decision. You can't just sit there and waffle for 7 minutes about any of these things. You have to decide and have a rationale to back up your choice. If you can back that up with personal experiences, anecdotes from your own life, the internet, publications, whatever it is, like have some rationale and reason, choose an answer, stick to it, and give your reasoning. I think that makes for a really, really strong MMI interview. So I think that's what I recommend is just prepare a lot, practice your anecdotes, and have them kind of readily available, either written down in front of you on the interview day so you can just glance down, or just top of mind for when you're trying to answer these questions.
Yeah, I definitely want to emphasize that. I think it's really important to try to think about your answers beforehand and to write them down. You don't necessarily have to memorize the exact wording of what you wrote down to answer these questions, because you definitely don't want to sound robotic in these interviews, but it is necessary to write out your answers beforehand. And then Amani, if you have any tips for interviews.
Yeah, we actually just did mock MMIs as part of one of our daily webinars, or not daily, but monthly webinars that we did last Friday. So it's fresh in mind some of the feedback for them. I would recommend that if you do give an allotted time for you to provide your answer, don't feel obligated to take up that time. Just take as long as you need to be able to articulate the answer clearly and concisely. Some of the feedback I gave to students was if I did kind of feel like they were rambling, like Kristen was saying, if you think about it, like you're writing a paper, you have your roadmap up front, from answering the question, highlighting it, telling us what you're going to talk about, answer the question, and kind of recap it, just so that it's an immediate recall for the interviewer. But kind of rambling, just kind of going on, makes it feel like you don't really know what your answer is, and that's not what they're looking for, right? I would say that there's a lot of prep that you can do for sure. When we do mock MMIs, we just look for the questions on Google, so I'm sure that they're fairly similar in theme. Some of the ones that do catch people off guard would be more so of like, so what's a common, kind of what Arthur was saying. So it was a good resource that was shared, but what's common in the industry, like what's a moral or an ethical challenge that you might face in this specific interest that you have, or this one niche thing that you may not have shown interest on your application, but they're looking to see how well-rounded you are and how well-informed you are. So the more you can kind of stay up to date, the more helpful, more insightful your answers can be. And then you might want to prepare for the school you're interviewing to. So if you are applying to like the prime program at DGSOM, and you have a specific interest in that community that program's interested in, or if you are interested in like the global health pathway or the equity health path or the urban health equity pathway, finding ways to incorporate that into your answer, not in a way where you're like, I'd love to join this program because X, Y, and Z, but just so that you can, connect your experiences and your answer to kind of reiterate you have shared values and a dedicated interest in community school.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for all of that as well. And then one question that I wanted to ask the panelists also about interviews is what are some mistakes that applicants can make during the interviews and how to mitigate these if possible? I think someone earlier alluded to, the difficulty of trying to maintain eye contact in these virtual interviews. And I think it is really helpful to kind of put a little sticky note up right by the little camera dot and try to really keep your eyes up there the whole time because it does look weird if you're like talking down to the corner. They may think you're like looking at notes or like, weird things. So definitely try to do that. And then other mistakes, I think in interviews, one would be just like rambling, not really having thought your answer through before you answer the question. Um, is not a great look because then you can just keep rambling for a couple minutes before you finally get to your answer. So again, I think the interview prep process is really important for that. Sarah, if you want to start.
Yeah, I guess for me, having done virtual interviews so far, I didn't have the best lighting in my apartment at the time, and so I had to go out of my way and buy a ring light on Amazon with like multiple like light option settings that kind of match the color of my walls and whatnot to make it look a bit better. Would highly recommend for you to have maybe like a clear background during your virtual interview, as well as a very quiet space, especially if you're living with other folks, like to just let them know ahead of time you're doing a very important interview, and to not be bothered during those times and having signs set up so that people don't knock on your door. Another common mistake is, I don't know if it's like something you can control, but your Wi-Fi could go out during the interview. I know it did for my friend. And so she had to turn on her hotspot during the interview. So just always be prepared for things that can happen with virtual interviews. Um, but yeah, I think those are like the common mistakes I can think of for virtual interviews so far.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, Arthur, if you want to go next.
Yeah, so I mean, other than blatant red flags like being late or being disrespectful, a really common but I think not frequently thought of mistake is coming into the interview with an agenda to tell the interviewer something, even if it's not really an answer to the question that you were asked. Like, let's say you come into an interview and you really want to talk about X experience, but no question asked during that interview is really relevant to that. And it doesn't really answer the question that they're asking you. I don't think that looks good. And I think that's one of the pitfalls that a lot of applicants can fall into because they think, this experience is so great. I need to talk about it. But it's got to be related to the question. I mean, fundamentally, they ask you those questions for a reason, and it's kind of like indirectly disrespectful to not answer the specific question that was asked of you. So, kind of like a similar theme to what all of us talked about before, the application, the interviews, it's really not a trick. You have a question in front of you, just answer the question. Really, that it comes down to that. Answer the question. Don't dance around the question and kind of answer it. That's not great. That doesn't look good. It also, would you want a doctor that doesn't really answer your question as a patient? You wouldn't really want that. If you go to a doctor and you have a very specific question, you want a specific answer. So that also doesn't look good if you're trying to assess for, future physician like qualities you'd want from your medical students. So all of that just, it's a long way of saying just really answer the question. Respect everyone's time. They're there for a reason. They have a question they want to ask you. You have this opportunity, answer the question. just to answer the question.
Simple. I like it. Kristen, if you have any tips.
Yeah, I think keep it simple, like be on time, be respectful of people. I would recommend pull your desk out from the wall and flip it around so that you are only like 3 feet in front of the wall. Like I would not do an interview with this blurred background because they can still see stuff and it's distracting. Like a nice blank wall like Arthur has, I think looks the best in an interview. I also, like Serenay, spent the $20 and got a ring light. I'm using it now. My lighting is fantastic. I love it. It was a great investment for the interview season. And then I think in terms of just like other faux pas of interviewing, people get really excited and talk, not only just ramble, but talk really fast. I know I am prone to do that as well. So making sure you intentionally slow yourself down, and that will prevent you from just fumbling over your words as well as rambling on too long because you have time to stop yourself if you are intentionally slowing down your words. And it makes you sound a little bit more confident in your answering. For the most part, try not to hype yourself up too much. I know I talked a lot about like preparing really well for these interviews, but for the most part, I had a lot of fun on my interview days, right? Like you're just there to talk with people about your experiences, why you want to be a doctor. Hopefully that's an exciting thing for you. I know it was for me. I had some great conversations with people. So try to relax and have fun with it. It shouldn't be a death sentence. They should be like a nice, normal conversation with nice, normal people who want you to come to this medical school. So they end up being a good time. I would also say for sure, write a thank you email. Just write down the names of the people who interviewed you. If you can get their contact information during the email or during the interview, that's great. If not, you can do some quick Google searching. There's usually a standard format of like first initial, last name at whatever ucla.edu or something that you can find them online, and just send them a thank you email. Make it personal and mention things you talked about in the interview. I got some really nice responses from all the people that I sent thank you interviews to or thank you emails to, and I think that that goes a long way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. With the emphasis on make sure you write down their names because if you don't and you forget them later, it's really hard to find out, who they were and how to get in touch with them. So definitely write down their names. Christine, if you want to go next.
I think I'd like to add just a few more things that were mentioned. Similar to what Kristen said, you don't want to ramble or talk really fast. So inserting pauses is very important because it also demonstrates, sorry, that you're opening up the discussion for the interviewer to ask you a question. It's not just you talking for 7 minutes straight. That's not a good sign. Um, I think this is such a small thing, but I do think it goes a long way. Introduce yourself when you go into your breakout room. Yes, your name is on the Zoom, but it's just customary as if you were walking into an in-person interview. You would shake the person's hand and introduce yourself. So same thing goes here online. Introduce yourself. And then I think one other thing that I think is so critical is as you're practicing, record yourself in preparation for your interviews because then you're going to catch yourself saying things like as you're talking through. And you want to avoid using filler words as much as possible during your actual interview because you want to demonstrate that you actually have substance to talk about, not just filling up the time and the space with words as you're trying to gather your thoughts. So I think it's good practice, even before your interview, to really catch yourself and be cognizant of the times that you're using filler words. Because instead of using those words, you can just insert pauses, which are natural breaks in conversation, and then carry on the conversation in a manner that's normal, but also demonstrates to the interviewer that you've actually taken the time to prepare your answers.
Yeah, great response as well. And then Amani, if you have any tips.
Yeah, the only quick things to add would be for that note about eye contact. If you think about minimizing your zoom and moving up just so that eye contact might feel a little bit more natural. And then I would definitely recommend taking as much time to prepare for your answers as much as possible. I know during the mock memoirs we did last week, there was someone who, so kind of similar to what Arthur was saying, like don't phone with agenda. When he was preparing, he mentioned there was like a specific sentence that he wanted to say, and then he ended up getting caught up with it because he was like, oh, I prepped that, and then kind of forgot to think about the rest of the question. Make sure you break the question down. If it's multi-part, make sure you're answering all the parts of it. But then also kind of what Kristen was saying, you've made it this far. You should go in confident. You should go in relaxed. Take deep breaths. It should be a conversation. It should be a comfortable, enjoyable experience. And they're looking for reasons to say yes, not no. So kind of lean into that and, just reiterate why you're a great candidate, why you not just make a good medical student, but a great physician at the end. That's the end goal.
Yeah, thank you. These have all been such great tips tonight. I know we are about to end in about 1 minute. I did want to send one last thing in the chat. And if everyone wants to check the chat, I put in a little link to the website that Arthur was talking about earlier that has some helpful resources for preparing for MMIs. Has a lot of good reading on there if you would like. And then also for your MMIs, I think it's really helpful if you know very well the 4 principles of medical ethics. So I'm just going to type them in here and then try to learn them a little bit more in depth than what I put here. But they're very helpful in terms of trying to integrate these into your MMI answers. Yeah. All righty. Well, thank you so much, panelists, for your time tonight. And thank you, attendees, for joining. I hope this was very helpful. And I hope everyone has a good night. Thank you.